The city of Washington, D.C. was bathed in the warm hues of a late afternoon, the golden glow of the Capitol dimming as the sun began its descent. High above the horizon, a massive cross towered over the city, its skeletal, incomplete structure casting long and ominous shadows over the bustling streets. This cross, a monument intended to symbolize the piety of the nation, had become a controversial project, an ambitious undertaking by the influential politician, Richard Anderson. Richard watched the construction from the window of his office, his sharp features reflected in the glass. To the public, he was a man of power, known for his charisma and seemingly inexhaustible ambition. However, beneath the surface, a storm was brewing, one that threatened to unravel the carefully constructed image he had cultivated over the years. He had risen from the depths of poverty to the heights of political success, driven by an unrelenting desire to escape the shadows of his past. The cross was supposed to be his crowning achievement, a public display of his supposed devotion to faith and the people of Washington. But for Richard, it was a smokescreen, an elaborate facade to distract from the web of corruption that had sustained his career. As he turned away from the window, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. The recent incidents at the construction site weighed on him, though he refused to admit it. Accidents were not uncommon in projects of such magnitude, but there was something about these that unsettled him, a sense that something beyond his control was beginning to take shape. Across the city, Emily Brooks, a determined journalist with a fierce sense of justice, sifted through a pile of papers on her cluttered desk. Her small office was lit only by the faint glow of her computer screen, the city's night lights flickering through the window behind her. She had been closely following the construction of the cross, not because she was interested in the religious implications, but because something about the project didn't add up. Emily's instincts rarely failed her. In recent weeks, she had uncovered inconsistencies in the project's funding, discrepancies that suggested a problem much deeper than mere mismanagement. The more she dug, the more she suspected that the cross was not just a monument to faith, but a monument to Richard's greed and corruption. She leaned back in her chair, staring at a photo of Richard on her screen. His face was the picture of confidence, but Emily knew better. She knew that behind that smile, behind those eyes, there were secrets she was determined to expose. The sun sank lower, and the shadows of the cross stretched further across the city, a silent herald of the darkness that was to come. Chapter 2: A Broken Conscience. Richard Anderson's mornings usually began with a sense of purpose, driven by the endless tasks that accompanied his office. But today, as he sat in the grand dining room of his luxurious penthouse, the weight of his conscience pressed down on him. Sunlight filtered through the large windows, casting a harsh light on the opulence that surrounded him, a sharp contrast to the turmoil within. The television in the corner droned with the morning news, but Richard's attention was elsewhere. He could hear the reports about the cross's construction, the controversies it had sparked, and the mixed reactions from the public. But it was the brief mention of an accident at the site that caught his attention, pulling him out of his thoughts. His hands tightened around the coffee cup he held, the hot liquid spilling slightly over the edge. He had been avoiding the details, dismissing the incidents as mere unfortunate events. However, as more reports emerged, each more troubling than the last, Richard could no longer ignore the unease gnawing at him. Memories of his past began to seep into his thoughts. Memories of deals made in the shadows, bribes accepted, and lives ruined in the name of progress. These memories had been buried deep, hidden under layers of success and power, but now they were clawing to the surface, demanding his attention. The first accident had been easy to explain. A worker had fallen, a simple mishap, nothing more. But then more accidents followed. Equipment failures, inexplicable injuries, and rumors among the workers of something unnatural at the site. Richard had dismissed the talk as superstitious nonsense, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. As he left his penthouse, heading to his office, the city felt different. The streets, usually vibrant, seemed muted, the faces of people etched with an unease that mirrored his own. He passed by the construction site, its imposing structure dominating the skyline, and for a moment, He felt as if the cross was watching him, judging him for his sins. Meanwhile, Emily Brooks was piecing together the puzzle of Richard's past. She had spent hours combing through financial records, political reports, and testimonies from those who had crossed paths with him. The picture that emerged was damning. The portrait of a man who had built his empire on deceit and corruption. But Emily wasn't just after a story. This investigation was personal. Her father had been one of the many victims of Richard's ruthless climb to power, a man who had lost everything because of one of Richard's shady deals. Her quest for the truth was fueled by a desire for justice, not just for her father, but for all those who had suffered because of Richard's greed. As the day progressed, Richard's anxiety grew. The pressure from the media, the public, and his own guilt was becoming unbearable. Father Joseph, the priest overseeing the spiritual aspect of the cross's construction, had noticed the change in Richard. The man who once exuded confidence now seemed tormented, his usual bravado replaced by a growing sense of dread. Father Joseph had known Richard for years, long before he became the powerful figure he was today. He had seen the good in him once, but that goodness had been consumed by ambition. The priest had tried to reach out to offer counsel, but Richard had always rebuffed him, too consumed by his pursuit of power. But now, as Richard stood on the brink of a crisis, Father Joseph knew it was time to intervene. He could see that the accidents at the site were more than mere coincidences. They were manifestations of a deeper problem, one that couldn't be solved with money or power. As the day drew to a close, Richard found himself once again at the construction site, standing at the foot of the cross. The sun had set, and the city was bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. The cross loomed over him, a constant reminder of the burden he carried. Father Joseph approached him quietly, his presence bringing a sense of calm to the chaos in Richard's mind. "You can't continue like this, Richard," the priest said, his voice gentle but firm. "There is a darkness in your heart that must be brought to light. Confess your sins, seek redemption, before it's too late." Richard said nothing, his eyes fixed on the towering structure before him. The weight of his past was suffocating him, and for the first time in years he felt truly lost. The air was thick with anticipation at the construction site, as workers moved hurriedly, their voices rising above the clamor of machinery. The cross had reached a critical stage in its construction, and the pressure to complete it was immense. Richard Anderson stood on a makeshift platform overlooking the site, his face tense and gaunt. He had come to inspect the progress, but his presence only added to the unease that seemed to permeate the atmosphere. Despite the commotion below, a strange silence hung in the air, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Richard's eyes scanned the site, noting the tired faces of the workers, their movements mechanical and cautious. They had heard the rumors, the accidents, the inexplicable failures, and the fear was palpable. Suddenly, a loud crack split the air, echoing throughout the site. Richard's heart leaped into his throat as he turned toward the source of the sound. His eyes widened in horror as he saw a section of the scaffolding swaying dangerously, the metal groaning under a weight it could no longer bear. "Get back!" someone shouted, but it was too late. The scaffolding collapsed with a deafening crash, sending debris and dust into the air. The workers scrambled to safety, but several were caught in the chaos, their cries of pain and terror breaking the silence that followed. Richard stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The scene before him was one of devastation. Twisted metal, shattered wood, and the injured lying amidst the rubble. His chest tightened with a familiar sense of dread, the weight of his guilt crushing him like never before. Father Joseph, who had been nearby, rushed to the fallen, offering words of comfort and hurried prayers as emergency crews arrived. The priest's heart broke at the sight, knowing that this was not merely an accident, but a manifestation of a deeper darkness, one that Richard could no longer ignore. Richard watched, his hands trembling as he gripped the railing. The blood drained from his face as he realized the magnitude of the disaster. This was no longer something he could dismiss or cover up. The cross, which was supposed to be his redemption, was quickly becoming his undoing. Emily Brooks arrived at the scene shortly after the collapse. She had been following a lead nearby when she heard the commotion. The sight of the fallen scaffolding and the injured workers only fueled her determination. She knew this was the turning point in her investigation, the event that would expose Richard's corruption for all to see. As she moved through the crowd, taking notes and speaking with witnesses, her mind raced with the implications. This was more than just a story. It was the moment that could bring down one of the most powerful men in Washington. But even as she pursued the truth, a part of her couldn't help but feel a twinge of pity for Richard. He was a man trapped by his own actions, and now he would have to face the consequences. Richard's eyes met Emily's across the site, a moment of silent recognition passing between them. He knew she was there to expose him, to tear down everything he had built. But in that moment, he also knew she was right. The truth could no longer be hidden. As the chaos of the collapse subsided, Richard felt a cold sweat break out on his skin. The cross loomed above him, a silent judge, and for the first time, he wondered if it would ever be completed, or if it was destined to remain as a monument to his failure. The morning after the collapse, Washington, D.C. was abuzz with news of the disaster. Every newspaper, every TV channel, every social media platform was ablaze with images of the incident. The narrative was clear. The cross, intended to symbolize hope and faith, had become a symbol of corruption and negligence. Emily Brooks's article was the most damning of all. She had spent the night compiling her notes, reviewing interviews, and piecing together the story. By dawn, her report was ready. An in-depth analysis of the corruption behind the cross, complete with evidence of Richard Anderson's misdeeds and the tragic consequences they had caused. The article hit like a bombshell. Within hours, it was the top story across the city, and Emily's phone didn't stop ringing. Everyone wanted to know more: journalists, politicians, and even ordinary citizens who had followed the project from the beginning. The public's reaction was swift and unforgiving. The collapse had turned the cross into a lightning rod for all the anger and frustration that had been simmering beneath the surface. Richard was inundated with calls from his advisors, all of them scrambling to contain the damage. But it was clear that the situation was spiraling out of control. His political allies were distancing themselves, and his enemies were circling like vultures, eager to use this scandal to bring him down. As the day wore on, Richard found himself increasingly isolated. He retreated to his office, the usually bustling space now eerily quiet. The noise of the city seemed distant, muffled by the thick walls that once made him feel secure but now only deepened his sense of isolation. Father Joseph had tried to reach out to him several times, but Richard ignored the calls. He couldn't face the priest, not after what had happened. The collapse had shaken him to his core, and for the first time, he found himself questioning everything he had done. The guilt, which had been a constant, nagging presence in the back of his mind, was now a roaring storm, threatening to consume him entirely. Emily, meanwhile, was relentless. She continued digging deeper, determined to uncover every last detail of Richard's corruption. She interviewed workers, pored over financial records, and even spoke to those who had known Richard in his early days. People who remembered a time when he wasn't consumed by ambition and greed. The more Emily uncovered, the more she realized that Richard wasn't just a villain in her story. He was a complex figure, a man who had started with good intentions but had been corrupted by the very system he sought to control. This complexity made her investigation even more compelling and even more personal. That same afternoon, as Emily reviewed her notes in the dim light of her office, she received an unexpected call. It was from one of Richard's former associates, a man who had been involved in the early stages of the cross's construction. His voice was shaky, laden with fear, as he revealed crucial information. The site where the cross was being built had once been the scene of a tragic accident, years ago, caused by one of Richard's earliest corrupt deals. Emily's heart raced as she jotted down the details. This was the connection she had been searching for, the link that tied Richard's past sins to the present disaster. As she hung up the phone, she knew that her next article would be the final nail in Richard's coffin. Meanwhile, Richard sat alone in his office, the weight of the world pressing down on him. The collapse, the public outcry, and Emily's relentless pursuit were all too much. He felt the walls closing in, the shadows of his past creeping ever closer. And for the first time in his life, Richard didn't know how to fight back. The city of Washington, D.C. was in chaos, and at its epicenter stood Richard Anderson, the once powerful politician now facing the full weight of his past sins. The day after Emily Brooks's second article went viral, Richard's office was flooded with calls from journalists demanding answers, from allies seeking to distance themselves, and from legal advisors preparing for the worst. The walls of his fortress were crumbling, and Richard knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Richard sat at his desk, staring at the phone in front of him. The call he needed to make weighed heavily on his mind. He had spent the night wrestling with his conscience, the ghosts of his past growing larger with each passing hour. The collapse of the cross had shaken him to his core, but it was the revelation of the connection to his earliest crimes that threatened to break him completely. Finally, with trembling hands, he picked up the phone and dialed Father Joseph's number. The priest answered on the first ring, his voice calm and serene, a stark contrast to the turmoil Richard felt inside. "Father, I need to talk to you," Richard said, his voice barely audible. "It's urgent." There was a brief pause on the other end, and then Father Joseph replied, "I'm on my way, Richard. Stay where you are." The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. Richard's thoughts raced as he considered what he was about to do. Confessing to Father Joseph was one thing, but he knew the truth needed to be made public. The world deserved to know the full extent of his crimes, and he had to face the consequences. But the fear of losing everything, his power, his reputation, his freedom, was paralyzing. Father Joseph arrived shortly after, his expression somber as he took in the sight of Richard. The man before him was a shadow of the confident politician he had once known. There was no trace of the bravado that had carried Richard through his career. Instead, Father Joseph saw a man on the brink of collapse. "Richard," Father Joseph said gently as he sat across from him, "tell me what's weighing on your heart." Richard took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he clasped them together. "Father, I've done terrible things. Things I can't undo." His voice cracked, the weight of his words crushing him as he finally began to unburden himself. "The cross. It's being built on the site of an old building that collapsed years ago. A building that collapsed because of my actions." Father Joseph listened intently, his face a mask of concern as Richard continued. "I took bribes, cut corners, and people died because of it," Richard confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "And now, this cross. It was supposed to be my redemption, but it's built on the foundations of my sins. I thought I could bury the past, but it's come back to haunt me." The priest remained silent for a moment, letting Richard's words hang in the air. Finally, he spoke, his tone measured and compassionate. "Richard, redemption is not something that can be built or bought. It must be earned through truth and sacrifice. You've taken the first step by confessing, but now you must make amends. The truth must come to light." Richard nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "I know, Father. I know what I have to do, but I'm scared. I'm scared of what will happen when everyone knows the truth." Father Joseph reached out, placing a comforting hand on Richard's shoulder. "Have courage, Richard. You can't change the past, but you can choose how to face the future. It's time to take responsibility for your actions." Richard nodded again, the determination growing within him. He knew Father Joseph was right. The time for hiding was over. That night, Richard called a press conference. The news spread quickly, and by the time he stepped onto the stage, the room was packed with reporters, cameras, and curious onlookers. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. Richard stood at the podium, his heart pounding in his chest. The lights were blinding, and the cameras clicked incessantly as he looked out at the sea of faces before him. For a moment, he hesitated, the fear threatening to overwhelm him. But then he remembered Father Joseph's words, "Redemption must be earned." Taking a deep breath, Richard began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've called you here today to tell the truth about the cross, about my actions, and about the consequences that have led us to this point. The room fell silent as Richard revealed his sins. He spoke of the bribes, the shortcuts, and the tragic consequences of his decisions. He admitted his responsibility for the collapse of the old building and the lives lost as a result. He confessed to the corruption that had tainted the construction of the cross, turning what was meant to be a symbol of hope into a monument to his failures. As he spoke, the weight of his guilt lifted slightly, replaced by a new sense of purpose. The truth was now out, and there was no turning back. When he finished, the room erupted into chaos. Reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing, and the murmur of shocked voices filling the air. Richard stepped away from the podium, his legs weak but his heart lighter than it had been in years. The road ahead would not be easy, but it was the path he needed to take. For the first time, he was ready to face the consequences of his actions and seek the redemption he so desperately needed. The days following Richard Anderson's confession were a whirlwind of activity. The public was in shock, the media was relentless, and Washington, D.C.'s political landscape was shifting rapidly. Richard's confession had unleashed a storm, and the investigation into his past actions was in full swing. Emily Brooks watched it all unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. She had achieved what she set out to do: expose Richard's corruption and hold him accountable for his actions. But as she read the transcripts of his press conference, something nagged at her. There was a sincerity in his words that she hadn't expected, a vulnerability that suggested Richard was truly remorseful. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, that Richard's journey was far from over. As she dug deeper into the investigation, Emily uncovered new information. Details about the tragic accident that had occurred at the site of the old building, the same site where the cross was now being constructed. The more she investigated, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. The accident had been the result of a poorly constructed building, one that Richard had pushed through without proper oversight. It had been one of his first major projects, a stepping stone in his rise to power. But the collapse had killed several people, including Emily's father, a fact that had haunted her for years. As Emily sifted through the documents, the realization hit her like a wave. The cross was not just a monument to Richard's sins. It was a direct link to the tragedy that had shaped her own life. The revelation was both devastating and enlightening. Everything she had done, every step she had taken in her career had led her to this moment. Emily knew what she had to do. She had to confront Richard, make him understand the full magnitude of his actions. Not just for the sake of justice, but for the sake of closure. She needed answers, and she needed them from him. She arranged a meeting with Richard through Father Joseph, who had been supporting Richard in the wake of his confession. The priest understood Emily's need for answers and agreed to facilitate the meeting, knowing it could be a crucial step for both Richard and Emily. The meeting took place in the quiet sanctuary of the church where Father Joseph served. The setting was solemn, the air heavy with the weight of the past. Richard sat in one of the pews, his head bowed, lost in thought. He had been expecting this confrontation, though he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. Emily approached slowly, her footsteps echoing in the empty church. She sat down beside him, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. For a moment, neither of them spoke, each waiting for the other to break the silence. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice firm but laced with emotion. "My father died in that building collapse, Richard. The building you pushed through without regard for the consequences. He was just one of many who paid the price for your ambition." Richard's breath caught in his throat. He knew his actions had caused pain and suffering, but hearing it directly from someone affected brought the reality crashing down on him. He turned to look at Emily, his eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry, Emily. I know my words can't bring him back, and I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I need you to know that I truly regret what I've done." Emily searched his face, looking for any sign of deceit, but all she saw was a broken man, consumed by guilt and remorse. It was clear that Richard was sincere, that he was carrying the weight of his actions with a heavy heart. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Emily admitted, her voice breaking, "but I needed to hear you say that." I needed to know that you understand the pain you've caused. Richard nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. I understand, Emily. I understand now more than ever. And I'll do whatever it takes to make amends, even if it takes the rest of my life. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the past hanging between them. It was a fragile peace, but it was a start. For Emily, it was the beginning of closure, a step toward healing the wound that had defined her for so long. For Richard, it was an opportunity to take the first step on the long road to redemption. As they left the church, the sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light through the stained glass windows. It was a moment of quiet reflection, a brief respite in the storm that had consumed their lives. And in that moment, both Emily and Richard knew that their paths were forever intertwined, bound by the sins of the past and the hope for a better future. The day of the cross's inauguration arrived, and with it, a sense of foreboding hung over Washington, D.C. The city, usually full of energy, seemed subdued, the streets quieter than usual, as if the people could feel the weight of what was about to happen. The sky was overcast, thick clouds gathering ominously above, threatening rain. Richard Anderson stood in front of a mirror, adjusting his tie with trembling hands. His reflection stared back at him, the image of a man who had aged years in just a few weeks. The once confident, almost arrogant politician was now a man burdened by guilt, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Today was supposed to be a day of celebration, but for Richard, it felt more like a day of reckoning. He knew that the cross, now completed despite the numerous setbacks, would be forever tainted by the truth he had revealed. The public had turned against him, and though he had confessed, the anger and resentment were palpable. Still, he knew he had to face them. He had to stand before the crowd and accept whatever judgment they chose to pass on him. Father Joseph met Richard at the church, his presence a steadying influence on the troubled man. The priest had been a constant source of support, guiding Richard through the turmoil of the past weeks. As they prepared to leave for the inauguration, Father Joseph placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. No matter what happens today, Richard, remember that you've taken the first step toward redemption. It's a difficult path, but it's the right one, Father Joseph said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. Richard nodded, grateful for the priest's words. He knew today would be the ultimate test of his resolve. The cross was more than just a monument. It was a symbol of his sins, and now it would be the stage for his atonement. When they arrived at the site, Richard was met with a sea of faces. The crowd was immense, the atmosphere tense. Some had come to witness the inauguration, but many were there to see Richard face the consequences of his actions. The air was thick with anticipation, the tension almost tangible. The cross loomed above them, its massive structure casting a long shadow over the gathered crowd. It was a reminder of everything that had led to this moment. The corruption, the tragedies, and the confessions. Richard took a deep breath, preparing himself for what was to come. Emily Brooks was in the crowd, watching from a distance. She had come not as a journalist, but as someone who had been deeply affected by Richard's actions. Their conversation in the church had left her with mixed feelings. She still harbored anger, but there was also a growing sense of understanding, a recognition of Richard's genuine remorse. She was there to see how he would handle this final challenge. As Richard stepped onto the stage, the crowd fell silent. All eyes were on him, the weight of their gazes almost suffocating. He cleared his throat, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "Thank you all for coming," Richard began, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Today, we are here to inaugurate a monument that was meant to symbolize hope, faith, and the future of our city. But instead, it has come to represent something very different. My failures, my corruption, and the consequences of my actions." The crowd remained silent, their faces a mixture of anger, sadness, and curiosity. Richard continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke from the heart. "I cannot undo the damage I've caused. I cannot bring back those who lost their lives because of my decisions. But I can stand here today and take full responsibility for what I've done. I can face the truth and accept whatever judgment you decide to pass on me. As he spoke, the clouds above grew darker, and the first drops of rain began to fall on the crowd. It was as if the heavens themselves were preparing for what was to come. The cross behind me was built on a foundation of lies, deceit, and blood. It stands as a reminder of the price we pay when we let greed and ambition blind us to what truly matters. But I hope that, in the end, it can also serve as a reminder of the importance of truth, accountability, and redemption. Just as Richard finished speaking, a bolt of lightning split the sky, followed by a thunderclap that echoed across the city. The crowd gasped as the lightning struck the cross, the massive structure shuddering under the impact. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, the world holding its breath as the cross swayed ominously. Then, with a deafening roar, the cross collapsed. The massive structure crumbled, the sound of twisted metal and breaking stone filling the air. The crowd erupted into chaos, people scrambling for safety as debris rained down. Richard stood frozen, staring at the destruction before him. The cross, the monument to his sins, had fallen. In that moment, he felt a strange sense of release, as if the weight that had been crushing him had lifted, if only slightly. Father Joseph rushed to his side, pulling him away from the wreckage. The priest's face was pale, his eyes wide with shock, but he remained calm, guiding Richard to safety. As the dust settled, the extent of the destruction became clear. The cross was gone, reduced to a pile of rubble, its fall a dramatic end to a monument that had been doomed from the start. The crowd, shaken but unharmed, began to murmur, the atmosphere charged with a mix of awe and fear. Richard turned to Father Joseph, his voice trembling. "It's over, isn't it?" The priest looked at him, his expression one of quiet understanding. "The cross has fallen, but your journey has just begun, Richard. Redemption is a long road, and this is only the first step." As the rain began to fall more heavily, Richard and Father Joseph walked away from the site, leaving the rubble behind. The cross had fallen, but in its place, something new might rise, something built on truth, repentance, and the hope for a better future. The aftermath of the cross's collapse sent shockwaves through Washington, D.C. The news of the event spread quickly, with images and videos capturing the dramatic fall circulating across all media platforms. The city was abuzz with discussions, debates, and a mixture of outrage and sympathy for Richard Anderson, the man at the center of it all. Richard spent the days following the collapse in a state of numbness. The event had left him physically and emotionally drained, and the realization of what had happened weighed heavily on him. The cross, once a symbol of his ambition and failures, was now gone, but the consequences of his actions were far from over. He was summoned to court, where he faced multiple charges related to corruption, negligence, and the deaths caused by his actions. The trial was swift, the evidence overwhelming. Richard knew there was no escaping the punishment he deserved. He stood before the judge, accepting the sentence without protest. The verdict was severe: years in prison, the loss of his political career, and the stripping of all his titles and honors. For Richard, it was the ultimate fall, but also a necessary one. He knew this day would come, and in some ways, he felt relieved that it had finally arrived. As he was led away in handcuffs, Richard saw Emily Brooks among the crowd. She was watching him with a mixture of emotions: anger, sadness, and something that resembled compassion. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, Richard saw in her a reflection of the pain he had caused, not only to her but to many others. Father Joseph visited Richard regularly in prison, offering counsel and companionship during the long days of confinement. The prison was a harsh and unforgiving place, but within its walls, Richard found a strange sense of peace. There was no longer a need to maintain a facade, no need to hide behind lies and deceit. Here, he could confront the truth of his actions head-on. In the quiet of his cell, Richard began to reflect on his life, his decisions, and the path that had led him to this point. Memories of his rise to power, the deals made in the shadows, and the people he had hurt haunted him. But he also thought about the moments of truth: his confession, the collapse of the cross, and Father Joseph's guidance that had set him on this new path. Richard knew that redemption was not something that could be achieved quickly or easily. It was a journey, one that required patience, humility, and a willingness to confront the darkest parts of oneself. And so, he began that journey, day by day, working toward a better understanding of who he was and who he wanted to be. Meanwhile, Emily's life had also changed in the wake of the events surrounding the cross. The investigation that had consumed her life was finally over, but it had left her with a deeper understanding of the complexities of justice. She continued her work as a journalist, but with a new perspective, one that recognized the importance of compassion and the potential for redemption, even in the most unlikely places. One day, Emily visited Richard in prison, unsure of what she hoped to accomplish. As she sat across from him, the barrier between them both literal and figurative, she found it difficult to speak. The anger that had once driven her had faded, replaced by a deep and lingering sadness. "I came to say goodbye," Emily finally said, her voice soft. "I don't know what the future holds for either of us, but I needed to see you one last time." Richard looked at her, his eyes tired but clear. "Thank you, Emily, for everything. You helped me see the truth, even though it was painful. I know I've caused you more pain than I can ever make up for, but I want you to know that I'm truly sorry." Emily nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I believe you, Richard, and I hope you find peace, wherever this journey takes you." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Then, Emily stood to leave, ready to move forward with her life. As she turned to go, Richard called out to her. "Emily, I know it's too much to ask for forgiveness, but I hope that someday, you can find it in your heart to forgive me." Emily paused, then looked back at him. "Maybe someday," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But for now, take care of yourself." With that, she walked away, leaving Richard to continue his journey toward redemption, step by step. As the days turned into months, Richard settled into his new life in prison. He found solace in the small routines, the quiet moments of reflection, and the visits from Father Joseph. He began to see his time there not as a punishment, but as an opportunity to truly atone for his sins and seek the forgiveness he so desperately desired. The cross may have fallen, but in its place, something new was being built, a foundation of truth, humility, and the hope for a better future. Richard knew his journey was far from over, but he was determined to see it through, no matter how long it took. The seasons changed, and with them, so did the city of Washington, D.C. The collapse of the cross and the events that followed had left a lasting mark on the city, one that wouldn't be easily forgotten. The site where the cross once stood was now a quiet place, the rubble cleared away, leaving an open space that seemed to invite reflection. In the months following Richard Anderson's sentencing, the city underwent a transformation. The scandal had sparked a wave of reforms, with calls for greater transparency and accountability echoing through the halls of power. Politicians who once operated in the shadows now found themselves under intense scrutiny, and the people of Washington had discovered a renewed sense of purpose in holding their leaders accountable. Emily Brooks had changed as well. The investigation that had consumed her life was finally over, but it had left her with a deeper understanding of the complexities of justice. She continued her work as a journalist, but with a new perspective, one that recognized the importance of compassion and the potential for redemption, even in the most unlikely places. One afternoon, Emily found herself back at the site where the cross had stood. The area had been transformed into a memorial, a place for reflection and remembrance. The city had decided not to rebuild the cross, choosing instead to leave the space open, a reminder of the lessons learned from the tragedy. As she walked through the tranquil space, Emily thought about everything that had happened: the death of her father, the investigation, and her final conversation with Richard. She still carried the pain of her loss, but it no longer defined her. She had found a way to move forward, to channel her energy into something positive. The memorial was simple but powerful, a circle of benches arranged around a small plaque in the center, bearing the names of those who had died in the building collapse years ago. Emily sat on one of the benches, her mind drifting as she gazed at the plaque. The names were a stark reminder of the cost of corruption, but they also served as a call to action, a reminder that the fight for justice continued. As she sat there, lost in thought, Father Joseph joined her. The priest had become a familiar figure in the city, his quiet strength and wisdom guiding many through the difficult times that followed the collapse. "Good afternoon, Emily," Father Joseph said, his voice warm and gentle. "Good afternoon, Father," Emily replied, offering him a small smile. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, the weight of the past hanging between them. Finally, Father Joseph spoke, his tone reflective. "This place has become a symbol of something much greater than what was originally intended," he said, gesturing to the memorial. "It's a reminder of the power of truth, the importance of accountability. But it's also a place of healing, where people can come to find peace." Emily nodded, her eyes still fixed on the plaque. "I think it's fitting," she said softly. "The cross was built on a foundation of lies, but this is built on the truth. It's a place where people can come to remember, reflect, and find a sense of closure." Father Joseph looked at Emily, his expression thoughtful. "And you, Emily? Have you found closure?" Emily paused, considering his question. She had spent so much time chasing the truth, seeking justice for her father, that she hadn't thought much about what came next. But now, sitting in this quiet place, she realized that she had found a measure of peace. "I think I have," she said after a moment. "I've learned that justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes, it's about understanding, about finding a way to move forward, even when the past is painful." Father Joseph smiled, his eyes full of approval. "That's a wise perspective, Emily, and it's one that will serve you well in the future." They sat in silence for a while longer, the peace of the memorial surrounding them. Emily knew that her journey wasn't over, that there would be more challenges ahead, but she also knew that she was stronger now, more resilient. She had faced her past, confronted the man who had caused her so much pain, and had come out the other side with a renewed sense of purpose. As she prepared to leave, Emily turned to Father Joseph, a question lingering in her mind. "Do you think Richard will ever find redemption?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. Father Joseph considered her question carefully before answering. "Redemption is a journey, Emily, one that requires patience, humility, and a willingness to change. Richard has taken the first steps, but it's a long road. Whether he finds redemption depends on the choices he makes from here on." Emily nodded, accepting his words. She knew that redemption wasn't something that could be easily earned, but she hoped that Richard would continue to seek it, just as she had sought justice. As she walked away from the memorial, the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the city. Emily felt a sense of closure, but also a sense of new beginnings. The cross had fallen, but in its place, something new had emerged. A space for truth, for reflection, and for the possibility of redemption. And as she looked back at the memorial one last time, Emily knew that, no matter what the future held, she was ready to face it.